All right. Hello, everyone. So, welcome to our virtual event space. My name is Allie. You might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location, and I'm your host for this evening. I'm so excited to be introducing Ingrid Rojas Contreras and Alexander Chee here to discuss Ingrid's memoir, The Man Who Could Move Clouds. But before we get into the good stuff, on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. So for those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. We are having more and more of our events in person, which is so exciting, but our online event program is here to stay to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So if you haven't gotten your hands on any of the books that come up this evening and you'd like to, I will be linking books in chat. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in, grab a copy right off the shelf, or you can place an order online, come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local or not leaving the house, we of course ship. So go ahead and follow those links in chat to our website. While you're on our website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up this summer and fall. So if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course, follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. So we're especially excited for this event tonight because The Man Who Could Move Clouds is the most recent pick for our subscription box, the Signed First Editions Club. For those of you who are already members, welcome. We're so glad that you could join us. If you don't know, our Signed First Editions Club delivers 6 hand-selected signed first editions to your house every year. These are books we really love and are so excited to share. So if you'd like more information about joining the Signed First Editions Club, I will link more information in the chat. We would so love it if you joined the club. So tonight we are here for about an hour, and towards the end, we will be taking questions, of course. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause, connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in the chat. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A so that we can most easily find them. While you're in our chat and question spaces, I want to remind you to please lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, should any technical issues arise, we will work as quickly as we can to resolve them, and we appreciate so much your patience and understanding. Now, all right, so now it is time for all of us to settle in, because without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Ingrid Rojas Contreras, author of our book of the evening, of course, as well as the novel Fruit of the Drunken Tree, which was the silver medal winner in the first fiction from the California Book Awards, and a New York Times editor's choice. Her essays and short stories have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Believer, Ziziva, among many, many others. In conversation this evening, I'm so excited to introduce Alexander Chee, the best-selling author of the novels Edinburgh and Queen of the Night, and the essay collection How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, which is another Third Place bookseller favorite. He's a contributing editor at the New Republic, and his essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, T Magazine, the Sewanee Review, and essays have been anthologized in the 2016 and 2019 Best American Essays. He's received a United States Artist Fellow, a Guggenheim Fellow, and the recipient of numerous awards. So the book this evening is The Man Who Could Move Clouds, which was named a most anticipated book of the year by just about everyone, including Time Today, the Seattle Times, and Electric Literature. This memoir examines the violence that has impacted the author's family since the Spanish invasion of pre-colonial Colombia, and the perseverance of her Indigenous heritage in the magical practices that have carried through the generations. Third Place booksellers really deeply loved this book, and we are not the only ones. Patricia Patricia Engel said this book maps memory, myth, and the mysteries and magic of ancestry with stark tenderness and beauty. And Aro Kwan said that this memoir, quote, knocked me sideways with joy and awe. Without knowing it, I've wanted this book my whole life. So thank you all so very much for being here. Audience members, do not be shy in chat. I see you're not. I love this. If you need anything, let me know. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome, both of you. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Allie. Thank you so much for that wonderful intro.
Thank you also. Sorry, I was muted and trying to unmute. Congratulations, Ingrid.
Thank you.
You've had such a tremendous reception already for this book. It's been really exciting to see people discovering it, talking to you about it, celebrating it. It's interesting given the fears you describe in the book about the writing of the book. As you're going through the process, the way that your mother initially rejected this, and you posted an outline of it that I am going to ask you about a little bit on Twitter, just because it's a fascinating sort of explication, I guess, of the structuring of a memoir, but even like some of your own, I guess we'll call them suppositions about what you would include are also intriguing that I'd like to tease out. But I wonder, I guess, what does your mom think of it now that other people are actually reading it?
Initially, when I first told my mom that I wanted to write about our family and that I wanted to tell all of these stories, her immediate fear, well, she immediately said no, and she was just immediately afraid that we would be judged, and it's something that happened in her lifetime. Like my dad lost a couple of jobs, and they were kind of like socially shunned when people found out that she was a practicing curandera. And so for me, and I don't know if for anybody who's here, and maybe that term isn't familiar, but curandera is someone who is, it's kind of like a medicine man, but South American, and from mestizo lineage. And yeah, in South America, there's all of this judgment around it. And so I think her fear was that would happen. And yeah, I think that there was something terrifying about me suddenly kind of, claiming that in front of everyone and just, writing a book that is centering that experience. So I think now she is really happy with it. And I think that there's part of her that was expecting a kind of backlash. And when she hasn't seen that happen, I think that that's maybe been very healing for her. And I always joke, but she's about this, but I think that the thing that she's a Leo, and the thing that she's most excited about from this book or about this book is that she's on the cover. So she's just like very excited about that.
So the photo here,
yeah,
is that
like
her?
This one. She's very excited that she's on the cover. And that she's with my grandfather. But I think once I showed her the book, that's maybe when I've heard her be the most excited about anything that's book related. I showed her the cover and she was like, oh my God, one of my daughters put me on a cover of a book. I'm so happy. She just, so I think, but other than that, I think that it's been actually very healing for her to see that there hasn't been that backlash that she was expecting or that she lived, decades ago.
So in the book, you talk about how you look so much like how how that impacts you, but you really do see it when you see her face on the cover. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, that's so interesting that oh no, that's her mom. That's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. I've always loved that experience of having people have that, people that used to know her when she was young or my age. What happens when they meet me is they do a little bit of a double take, and I can see, it's a strange thing because I can see on their face when they're traveling back to something that they lived with my mother, but they're kind of addressing it to me. So it just becomes this very strange but very interesting space that I'm holding for them.
Mm. So one thing that I was curious about this is, I suppose, maybe a subtle thing, but I thought I would tease it out a little bit. I noticed at some point that there's a usage of the present tense in the telling of the story, which subtly signals that there's a present that you are writing from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's not that you're telling the whole story from the present tense, but I'm curious about that decision, because I'm sure it was something that you reasoned out very carefully.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that and maybe it came from the drafting, but one of the first things that I wrote from the book was the disinterment part. And I was writing that as we were doing it. And maybe I'll do a little summary for people who don't know what the book is about or what it covers. But so it's a book that initially I thought would be centered around my grandfather, who was a curandero, and people said that he could move clouds. And my mother became kind of a curandera after him. And around 2012, which is what I started to treat as the present of the story, is when two of my aunts and then my mom had a shared dream together. And the dream was that my grandfather came to each of them and then said, I want my remains to be disinterred. Because it happened in the same week to three people, we decided that this was a direction that we had to follow. So immediately we made plans and we bought our tickets to go to Colombia. And then our plan was to, somehow figure out how to dig up his remains and, figure out why, figure out what this dream was about and what was happening. So I started to write all of those scenes as they were happening, and I was writing them in airplanes, and I would, we would go out and do things all day, and then I would come back and I would start to type everything that I could remember from that day. So those passages of us first arriving in Colombia and then kind of having that experience of fading back in that country, in that place that I hadn't been to for a while back then. And we, just being on this errand of we're going to dig up my grandfather's body. And at that point, he had been 27 years in the ground. It just felt so surreal. And there was something about the present tense of it that even in revision, I didn't want to get rid of, because there was just the idea that I could have a quest, and it's this very mysterious quest, and that is how it was in life. That I really just wanted it to be the present of the story, and then everything else. There's a couple of parts that are in the middle of the book that I treated as kind of like an emotional unearthing of stories. And so, we unearthed this body, and then I just wanted to unearth stories and things that we didn't tell about this time, or about my grandfather, or about curanderos. And that became, to me, that felt like I was stepping out from the present narrative of unearthing the body, and so I wanted it to be in the past.
Okay, I mean, I think it creates a lovely sort of surface tension. You know, I think a lot of people imagine that the present tense is about immediacy, but I think there's a richness to it also, where the self that knows how the story is going to turn out and the self that does not know get to occupy the same space in a kind of narrative tension.
Yeah, I agree. Because there, you know, for the narrative to have, you know, me as a character who is, you know, following my mom and my aunts who are like, we're gonna dig up this body. We don't know what's gonna happen. You know, there's something very comical about me following them and trying to, you know, I'm, you know, completely deferred to them. They're very kind of powerful, very funny women. And there was something comical to me about that, being kind of like the I don't know what's happening character in that.
Yeah, it's the joke you make about a peer-reviewed dream, the shared dream, is an excellent one at conveying what that has to be like. I think I wondered also what it was like, because so again, for those who haven't read this, part of the story also is that this is a memoir about someone who has had amnesia and who has through that entered into a family legacy, this legacy of the secrets, the curandero. And so I wonder what it was like working with your memory. I mean, you've spoken of the urgency of having this be presented as a memoir instead of a novel, because of how you didn't want to seem like you were making any of it up. But you know, the amnesia, it's so interesting. It's such a part of, like, you know, like soap opera stories, telenovelas, and like, you know, the person who has amnesia and returns and doesn't, like, their past has gone away and they are sort of figure of mystery, etc. I wondered, like, what it was like to work with your memory after losing it.
Yeah.
If it felt different in any way.
Yeah, and maybe I'll mention, so the part where my mother became a curandera, like the doorway for her into that was because she lost her memory and she fell down this empty well, and from the impacts that she sustained on her head, she went into a coma and lost her memory when she was very young. And when she woke up, then she started to see ghosts and she started to see voices. And then from that point on, my grandfather started to teach her how to become a curandera. So for me, the amnesia was, I mean, all of the stories of my grandfather and my mother were so interesting to me growing up. And I always felt like things like that don't happen anymore. I always felt like that's, you know, those stories are so strange. They just don't happen in our modern world. And when I had an accident and lost my memory, my family was very excited about it because they felt that it was also like this was going to be my doorway into it. And I think I was excited about it too, just because it felt like I could suddenly become part of that lineage of, you know, a strange sequence of events happening, or just the idea of a story repeating from my mother's life to my life. It just felt like such a lovely thing to me. It's, I think, depending on where you hit your head when you have an impact like that, or you have an accident like that, you can lose a number of things. So I know a person who lost their ability to make memories in the present but they kept like the memories of the past. So it just kind of meant that they knew everything about their life, and they knew their name, and they knew just everything from, you know, the accident before. And they were living in this perpetual moment where they couldn't hang on to what the present was. And so, you know, you might have been sitting there and you would introduce yourself, and then they would, you know, say like, nice to meet you. And then 5 seconds later, they would be like, who are you? Right. So that, you know, you can kind of like lose your, for my mother and me, we both lost our you know, memory of the past, but we retained our ability to make memories in the present. And yeah, there's all sorts of things that can happen. You can lose your memory of language, you can lose your, you know, memory of speech. There's, you know, all sorts of things. And I think for me, just thinking through what can happen in an accident really tells me how unstable memory is. And we tend to think that it's just this very solid unit of life that we get to carry around and keep and hold. And actually, it's just very unstable. And, you know, even if we think about interviewing 5 different people that were at the same event, you know, we would get like very different 5 different stories of what happened. So I think when I was working with my memory, it was like handling like an unstable material is what it felt like to me. And I did get a lot of joy from when I would remember something and I would tell somebody else, like, remember we were at this bar and this thing happened. And they would say like, oh yeah, like that did happen. I remember that. I would get a lot of joy from having that sort of confirmation. But I think that there were other memories that came back where it just feels like there were glitches in the memory. So in one, I know that I'm, you know, I had a memory where I'm like in a bar talking to people, and in the memory, like we're talking in English, but the people that I'm like in the bar with only speak Spanish. So I know that there's like little glitches and things, which is also interesting. But yeah, so I think I just approached it as this is not the stable material that we think it is. And I'm just going to approach it as this is very unstable. And it became really fun for me to also interview my mother about what she remembered during her amnesia. Because that stage of when you have no memory and you are making memories, or you're understanding what the world is, to me, was just so fascinating to learn about. So to have my experience and then to also have her as someone that I could talk to was probably one of the most interesting parts of writing a book.
I mean, what's fascinating about the memoir also is that, I mean, what you say about the writing it down as it's happening is interesting, I think, in retrospect, because it also gives, in some ways, as much as it's a memoir, it's also something of a documentary of the thing that was happening. You know, you tell your mother that you want to write a book about this history, and she says no, threatens you with like never speaking to you again, and suddenly your grandfather appears in your dreams and takes you like you know, on a tour, and is, you know, like excited, and that's such a hilarious sort of not quite like a reproof of the mother, but it's sort of like it still feels a little bit like that, which is also what's funny when she just calls without explanation after hearing this and is like, okay, we're going. And I think you described that moment really well, and it's a very I think something you and your mother seem to have down is the sense to allow each other. You sort of say as much in the book, but to allow each other the opportunity to be like that without it meaning an end to love, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always felt really secure with my mother's relationship. And yeah, it's I think that even as I was a young girl, I would just follow her around and have her tell me stories. And I was always just so nurtured by her stories. And I think she was a mother who shared all of herself, as opposed to kind of like censoring maybe like for the adult parts or whatever. She would just kind of tell me everything and tell me about her flaws or things that she had done or violent things that had happened to her. So she would just kind of tell me everything. And so I always felt that we just had a very deep connection. And because of that very deep connection, whenever we had fights, it just never felt that serious. It never felt like it could get to the kind of like the bottom of this profound, being together that we had worked on for so many years.
So maybe this is a good time for you to read from the beginning.
Oh, yeah, sure. So this is chapter 1, The Secrets. They say the accident that left me with temporary amnesia is my inheritance. No house or piece of land or chest of letters, just a few weeks of oblivion. Mami had temporary amnesia as well, except where she was 8 years old, I was 23. Where she fell down an empty well, I crashed my bicycle into an opening car door. Where she nearly bled to death in Ocaña, Colombia, in darkness, 30 feet below the earth, I got to my feet seemingly unharmed and wandered around Chicago on a sunny winter afternoon. Where she didn't know who she was for 8 months, I couldn't remember who I was for 8 weeks. They say the amnesias were a door to gifts we were supposed to have, which Mami's father Nono neglected to pass. Nono was a curandero. His gifts were instructions for talking to the dead, telling the future, healing the ill, and moving the clouds. We were a brown people, mestizo. European men had arrived on the continent and violated indigenous women, and that was our origin, neither native nor Spanish, but a wound. We called the gifts secrets. In the mountains of Santander, the fathers had passed the secrets to the sons, who passed the secrets to the sons, who passed the secrets to the sons. But none of his sons, Nono said, had the testículos required to be a real curandero. Only Mami, strong-willed, unafraid, more of a man than most men in his eyes, whom he liked to call mi animal de monte, could have housed the gifts. But Mami was a woman, and such things were forbidden. If a woman came to possess the secrets, it was said that misfortune would soon follow. Yet as 8-year-old Mami recovered from her injuries after falling down the well, and as her memories returned, it so happened that from wherever her mind had gone, she brought back the ability to see ghosts and hear disembodied voices. The family says Mami was destined for the secrets, and since Nono couldn't teach them to her, the secrets had come directly to her. 4 decades later, when I suffered my accident and lost my memory, the family was thrilled. Tias poured drinks, told one another with an air of festivity, "There goes again the snake biting its own tail." And then they waited to see how exactly the secrets would manifest in me.
I love so many of the sayings that you include, like "there it goes, the snake biting its own tail," which is there's a sort of perfect poetical quality to it, as well as the very quick feeling of like this is how people talk. There's a number of moments like that throughout the book that I think are particularly really moving. Um,
Thank you.
so I was also interested in this idea of the, I mean, in some ways what you describe in terms of like how the secrets are passed down, they're not usually passed to women, but in this family they are. It reminded me of Jeanette Winterson's The Passion. I don't know if you have read that, but there's a one of the characters is like is a Venetian, and she's a, like, I guess the people who, my mind is blanking on the term for it, but the people who basically like ferry the boats through the canals in this sort of mythical retelling of or telling of this novel. They're all men, and they all have webbed feet, except for this one young woman in the novel who is born with the webbing. So it does have this sort of interesting feeling of like gods or spirits making new choices.
Yeah.
And for me, that was also part of what was so powerful about it. But I feel like I'm doing this thing that's actually like a bad interviewer thing, where I like give you some sort of long explication of what I'm thinking, and you're like, yeah, it's not very interesting. So
No, I will say, I think this is the reason why I really wanted to write this as memoir,
yeah,
was because, you know, when I first learned the story of my mother losing her memory, which is already just, you know, a very kind of rare thing to happen. When she told me that she fell down an empty well, do you know what I mean? I was just like, that is so, it just sounds like a fairy tale to me. Like you fall down this empty well, and there's something very mythical about that kind of journey. And yeah, so I for me, like if the story as it happened in real life already had those elements of, as if a writer was kind of constructing this. Do you know what I mean? Like the detail of the empty well, and like the man who could move clouds, and you know, how my mother and I look the same, and people have this very kind of confusing relationship to that. Like one of her boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, kind of kept looking at me like he was in love with me, and just having just like this very confused like space. And you know, so all of that just felt like, I mean, I kept saying in my head, like, the writing is so good, even though even though that was just kind of how life was happening. But I could kind of get that, had that sense of the synchronicity between things was just so fascinating, that I kept being like why I couldn't think of like how to even make this better, or it would almost be too perfect if I told it as fiction, which can happen with nonfiction sometimes, whereas yeah, things happen that way.
right. Like I remember when my sister was getting married, we were taking a boat ride out to the island where it was going to take place, and the entire family of her ex-boyfriend, who she thought she was going to marry, was also on the boat, except for him. At the last minute, he had decided not to come.
Oh my God.
And it's these are the kinds of things that, like, and if you put them in fiction, people are like, oh, sure,
Yeah.
you know, but in nonfiction, they have a different power. So you had debuted as a novelist. Did you have any hesitations about moving to memoir, or was it just like, no, this has to be a memoir? And do you have any favorite memoirs that you use as kind of like role models, I guess, or guides?
Yeah, I don't think that if I had hesitation, I think it was about, how do I keep track of the interviews? Or I had kind of like logistical hesitations of what does the process look like? Like, do I just record every conversation and then transcribe it. And I think as I started to do it, then I just decided on, at the end of the day, like when my memory was fresh, I would just write out pages and pages and pages of dialogue, conversations, descriptions. And that's what I ended up doing. And then I also had isolated interviews that I did with people over time, and then did transcribe those. But I think the part that I was the most nervous about was that part about how does this logistically work, and what happens if I am, building out the world. I think I erred on the safe side of it, so I would actually double check with whoever I was writing about and then tell them the descriptions that I had done and then asked if that felt accurate or not. So I know that I was actually very safe on that side of trying to be faithful as faithful as possible to reality. And that was the part that was the most difficult to me. Because I think when you're writing a novel, you can make the symbols work however you want. Or you can invent something, or you can just write a scene and have people have an interaction that you need for the narrative. And with memoir, you're given the pieces and then you have to figure out how to get the meaning that you have an intuition for from the pieces that you were given. So that problem to me was just so different. But I just really actually enjoyed it. It felt very challenging, but it felt very enjoyable at the same time. A memoir that I read a couple of times was Woman Warrior while I was writing this one. And I also read this other one that's called Girl in the Dark. That's about this woman who gets she suddenly gets like a severe light allergy, and she ends up having to go into deeper and deeper, like darker and darker corners of her house because she can't even have shadow. Like it kind of like burns her skin. So she kind of ends up in this isolation. But it was interesting to me because it was writing about being, but at the edge of reality. So I was really interested with reading that and then thinking about how do I write about amnesia? Because to me, that was the edge of perception, or it just feels like a very unstable place of self. So those were the two that I relied on the most to just kind of get inspiration, see. They were like sister books.
So I'm going to put this link to your diagram on Twitter of the book. For those of you who'd like to follow along if you haven't seen it, that's in the chat. And let's see. And so, I mean, I thought it was, first of all, these drawings in part 2 of like the symbols for each of the story are such an, I mean, it suggests you're possibly a cartoonist also.
I think we.
I sent it to the other panelists, but not to the group.
There we go. Yeah, third place books just shared it. Yes. Thank you.
There it is.
Yeah, I do. I love drawing. And there's, I don't know, when I'm writing a book, one of the things that I learned that I need to do is compress information or compress the narrative. And for me, drawing, makes it so that I can do that, but also without language. And so it just kind of invites abstract thinking. So for me, when I'm thinking about book structure, I actually need to be in the abstract thinking space as opposed to the language space.
I wondered, so I remember taking a learning styles test as a young person and being told I was a visual mathematician. I wonder if this is possibly also a situation, because I also like to draw diagrams of my structures, and I like to draw in general. But I was curious about specifically the idea of the poetic argument. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit on, like, what does a poetic argument mean to you?
Yeah.
In this book. Like, what would be one example?
Yeah, so somebody earlier was also talking about order images and trying to plot them throughout the book. I thought of the book as half of it is plot driven. So the part of the book that is plot driven is where we get this request of unearthing my grandfather, and then we go back and there's this kind of like quest and there's this journey, and we have to discover why he wants to be disinterred, and then there's the journey to doing it and what happens after and what we decide and what we uncover at the end. So that to me has a very clear plot sequence. And then the rest of the book is not linear in that way. It's not following like a linear narrative. And what I decided for myself is that I was making like a poetic argument through the book. And one of the words or one of the images that I was trying to make a poetic argument around was the idea of a mirror. And it appears very early on in the book, I think in the first chapter, because I'm describing how my mother and I look the same. We share the same moles that are in our bodies, weirdly. And then there's this one mole that we have over our shoulder, and she has it on one shoulder, and then I have it switched on the other shoulder. And I say that that's a mirror image. So I was trying to kind of map the meaning of what a mirror is. And later on in the book, I did this whole part that's just called the mirror. And I've just always been fascinated by mirrors. When both my mother and I had amnesia, seeing a mirror and like that action of like seeing yourself for the first time was very traumatic and was very intense for both of us. And when she saw herself in the mirror, she was actually still bruised up from, and her nose was broken, everything was kind of like swollen. And she described it as like one of her eyes was like melting into her cheek, and then the other one was like higher up. And so she just kind of like saw this and, imagine not remembering who you are and then suddenly seeing that. And for me, when I had amnesia and then I saw my reflection, there was this moment of thinking that I was making eye contact with someone else. And then the moment that I reacted and the reflection reacted how I reacted, and then this feedback loop started where I saw, like very kind of quickly understood I was looking at myself. And philosophically, to me, that is amazing, because it just means, like the moment where we understand who we are, or we have some recognition of what we are. So I knew very early on as I was plotting the book, because I had these three things together, that making a poetic argument around the mirror and what the mirror is and what it invites and how it's related to how we see ourselves, both in terms of like the self, but also as culture, like what are the cultures that get to have perfect mirrors and who are the cultures that don't get to have mirrors. So I think throughout the book, I was just tracking what mirrors mean. And so by the end, I'm coming to a poetic conclusion around all of that. So I kind of, I think of it as I'm writing a very long poem with each of these poetic arguments that I'm following. And then with this structure that I was making for myself, I was tracking how this poem would be written. And then the last line of it became so important because it's, carrying so much, and it's kind of like the end point of, this is the end of my thinking around what mirrors are.
And there's also a little mirror that you put under your pillow as a that's also part of that same section.
My grandfather told my mother while she was trying to recover her memories, he gave her a mirror, and he said, when you go to sleep, like, put it beneath your pillow and then dream on it, and then this will make your memories come back. So so the mirror just became this very important symbol. And I think with memoir, it's just about noticing what is that object that for some reason is touching the narrative in all of these ways, and what is that? Yeah, what does that mean, or like, what is the poetic argument that I can make around it?
All right, we are going to move to the Q&A box. Let's see, Christina Lamb asks, why is the title of the book The Man Who Could Move Mountains? Ingrid's mom plays such a central role in both this memoir and as a protagonist in Fruit of the Drunken Tree. She is the force of nature, so I'd love to hear thoughts about the book title.
We actually debated this question of having it centered around my grandfather, the title. And I think that to me, what really mattered was that my grandfather came from a lineage of, where men could only become curanderos and women were not allowed to do it. And I really loved how my mother interjected into that space and, made my grandfather kind of change, or like forced him to change. So I think that I saw it in the end as it's, he's kind of like the origin story for it. And so I wanted to start with him for that reason.
So let's see. Someone asks, can you talk further about exercises and methods, practical and creative, that you might suggest to someone who is really far from the world of MFA programs, trying to write their first novel? Is there anything that you took from, like, being a novelist that you used in the memoir that would apply to this?
I do think I love to say to students when I'm teaching plot and I'm teaching character development, and I think it both applies to fiction and nonfiction. But I think of it as a Venn diagram when you're thinking about characters. And, one circle is people who change, and then the other circle is people who don't change. So there's going to be, like, a situation in someone's life where, they're behaving a certain way, or they're stuck in their ways in some way, or, there's a situation that is asking them to change. And it's always this question of, will the character be able to do it, or will they kind of stay where they are? And the shared space that they both, that these two circles share, so the Venn diagram part, is to ask the question, how is this person ruining their own life? And that's how I think of character. And in memoir, that person is you. So you have to, figure out if you're a character who is changing, or a character who's not changing. And then, like, how are you ruining your own life?
Oh, that's such a good exercise.
It's a very evocative question to ask yourself.
I mean, I do feel like let's say most literary fiction is about people ruining their own lives thinking maybe somebody else is doing it. And a lot of the drama is like, will they figure that out or not? You know, will they complete the job of ruining their life, or will they somehow wake up in time and not ruin their life? It's certainly like something that I feel like I've watched like long-term friends and family struggle with, where it's like there's that one thing that they always slip on, you know. Is it gonna get them again? You know.
Yeah, and I think it's terrifying because it's so easy to see on other people.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, but how am I doing that? Like, it's so hard to see. But I think when you're writing memoir, like you do have to somehow, you know, try to get that that view on yourself. But I think with novels, if you're just starting out, then I think that maybe thinking about character that way can give you the plot, and it can kind of give you how this character is interacting with the world, and it can give you what's at stake for that character. You know, what is this character in danger of losing or winning?
So Christina Lamb has a second question. I was fascinated by the discussion of illness and the way it translates or does not translate. I wondered if the topographical disorientation was something that happened after the bike accident, or was even something that was a carryover from the trauma of war.
Yeah, so after my bike accident, one of the things that changed in my brain was that my ability to make mental maps is just not very present. And the way that it can happen is if, you know, for example, like we walk into the grocery store together and we walk down an aisle, I will immediately lose my sense of where the exit is, and I might just walk the wrong way. Like you might just be like, okay, let's go, and I will just kind of go to the back, and you're like, where are you going? So it's because my brain, I think everyone has like this very automatic, you remember where you came from, and your brain just does that automatically. And, you know, whatever happened with my accident, I just lost that ability, but not completely. So there's people who have an extreme version of that where they get lost inside their homes. So, you know, just kind of going from their bedroom to the kitchen, then they might not be able to find the bedroom again, or they will have to kind of try everything out until they find it. So it's not, to me, it's not to that degree, but it's to the kind of maybe like a little bit larger degree. Yeah, I don't think that I had a good sense of direction when I was, you know, little and before the accident, but this feels, this is very kind of like a different than you're just bad at directions.
Right. This is, it does feel like it's a completely different sort of category of experience. So someone is asking if you have any craft classes coming up that people can look up because of their admiration for the Twitter thread.
No. I do want to teach one on structure soon. I'm teaching one. I'm giving this craft talk on structure through Chicago like Story Studio. So if you're in Chicago, I think you can come see it. But otherwise, I do want to do it sometime for online. It involves me talking about structure and then looking at bird nests and talking about how bird nests are created and the structure of bird nests, and how it should all be from the environment and the materials that you have and what you're trying to kind of guard against. So I hope to do that someday.
Wow, okay. If you have a link to like a mailing list for you, maybe you could drop that in the chat.
I wish I had. I'm not like that organized.
Okay. Follow her on Twitter.
Yeah. Follow me on social media. That's how I'll announce it.
Right, Richard Frost asks, can you talk a bit about how you maintain the reality of your family's story when that reality is so different from that of other cultures around you, in the face of an American culture in which you live, how others might find the ability to recapture? Like, is there some advice you might offer other people about
Yeah.
that?
I had a really hard time initially trying to write this book because I knew, I mean, I live in the United States now, and so I have the voice of the people kind of around me, or like so I know what this would sound like to someone who's outside of the culture. And initially I had a very hard time writing because I would start to write and then I would have to kind of pause the narrative and say things like, I know you've never heard this before, or I know that this sounds wild, or like, for example, like I'm talking about my mother seeing ghosts suddenly, then I would pause the narrative and be like, so possibly, so you'd like another word for it might be hallucination, and this might be something that you're more, so I would just kind of like stumble all over the narrative. And at some point I realized that it had to do with the intended audience for the piece. One of the things that I started to do was instead of, imagining that I, have this person that I'm telling the story to who doesn't know what's going on, that I would just kind of be telling it to, as if I'm in a room with my family or other Colombians to whom this would be very normal too. And the moment that I started to do that, and I just started to tell the story how we tell it to ourselves, what it sounds like when we were in Colombia and we were talking about what is happening, that I just finally got out of my own way, and then the story started to just really flourish on its own. And then later in revision, when I already had a draft, I would look for places where I could bring the outside, the people who are outside the culture in, by having like little lines that could be little bridges for them to kind of come across or like enter into this world. So sometimes I would kind of throw that kind of like lifeboat out for people. But otherwise I just really wanted it to be, it just felt, the story felt more powerful when it was a story that I was telling to us, as opposed to me trying to kind of translate what the story is to somebody who has no idea what it is. So maybe the advice would be to look at audience and then think about what is the audience with whom the story would just flourish, or it would just kind of be in its more natural state. And when are you translating? Like when do you catch yourself trying to translate what this is? And is that necessary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, would you say maybe that's part of what you drew also as a lesson out of Woman Warrior?
Yes. Yeah, because that's a memoir where I think for that reason, just that memoir just gave me so much permission with, we get to tell our stories how we want, and we don't have to translate culture for anyone if it's not part of the vision, or if it's not part of, or if it kind of starts to make the narrative implode, like definitely we don't have to do that. I feel like when I first read Woman Warrior, there was just this flash of recognition that just ran through me of, in a way, like there's like so many parallels and so many kind of like things that I could see like with my life and with my family stories and the way that we talked about it. And it just felt so exciting the first time that I read that.
So a tiny follow-up, this I think is a good place to also maybe come to a close. Could you say a bit more about your mother's observation that nobody wants the truth, but everyone wants a story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was part of my mother's observation as a curandera and a fortune teller. She tells the story about how early days she would be telling fortunes and people would come with, to her with, very simple questions like, is my husband cheating on me? And then she would deal the cards and she would say, yes. And that would be the end of the session. And so the person would never come back. And she started to realize that, sometimes when people ask the question, they already kind of know the answer. And there's this little dance that happens with the truth and how, if you want to be a fortune teller, like a healer, a curandero, how part of it is figuring out how to give that person the truth in a way that they can receive it and, carry it with them until they're ready to kind of see that truth. So my mother always talked about how she would talk in parables or like tell them a story, or sometimes even doing a ritual that would be kind of like a representation of the truth that they needed to, suddenly be in relationship with, so just kind of trying to give them a way to engage with it as opposed to just telling them the thing. And so she always said that there's, when we just tell someone the truth, like it can feel a little violent. It's just like, even though we are like, tell me the truth, when we receive it, it just feels so violent. But if when you tell the truth, but in a story, you like disguise it in a story, then suddenly it can become something that people carry across their life, carry with them across their lives, and get to kind of unpack it at their own pace or get to unpack it multiple times. And it can become like a very healing process.
So, and I'm going to just actually quickly toss this. Melinda DeStefano here said something related to this. Do you understand your work as a writer in connection with your familiar legacy of being a curandero? You see your work with storytelling in the written word as part of that practice?
I think when my mother first told me that about fortune telling and the truth and, disguising the truth in a story, that probably marked the moment where I just became very interested in stories and what they could do. And as I became a reader and feeling in my own body what they could do for me, to me, that's why stories feel so powerful, is that, that act of you carrying, those stories with you, the ones that mean the most to you, and having access to those stories across your lifetime and how each time that you unpack them, it can just change your life. So to me, that just feels like very powerful. And so I do think of storytelling in that way.
Well, I think we are at the end of our time together.
Thank you, Alex. This was such a wonderful conversation. I so loved talking to you about this book and nonfiction.
Me too.
So I am back, unfortunately, to put an end to the fun. It's about time that we call it a night. I just want to take this last couple of moments to say a huge, huge thank you to all of you who've joined us today. For anyone who would like to get your hands on a copy of The Man Who Could Move Clouds, I'm going to relink it in chat. I am currently partway through this book and I'm obsessed with it. It is genuinely so good. Go pick this up if you haven't already. Of course, always let us know what you thought of this event, either in person or on social media. We always love to hear from you. Ingrid and Alexander, thank you so much for being here. This was such an incredible discussion. Do you have any last things you want to say before we say goodnight?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you so much for being here to everyone who came. And thank you, Alex.
It's my pleasure. Thank you also. Pre-order Best American Essays 2022. I'm the editor this year.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
I know, me too. Alrighty, everyone. So with that, I think it's time to do the waving thing. All right.
Bye.
Good night,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.